If there is one thing we all know about people in the olden days, by which I mean Western Europe during the high medieval and early modern period, so for England between about 1066 and say 1698, Hastings and William the Conqueror to George I and the House of Hanover, but well, it's all fairly arbitrary dating and it goes beyond and before and yeah. But if there's one thing we know about people in the olden days, it's that people got married really, really young. Heck, if you survived to be a teen, you'd be married straight off. There was no idea of being a child or of childhood, and as soon as you could, as soon as you were possible, you were wed. Right? Well, no. Well, okay, so I say that, but firstly, really? And secondly, how do I know? Well, okay. So firstly, I am talking about normal, average, everyday, common people. If you were super rich, by which I mean noble, or you were royal, then these rules do not apply. And some marriages did have enormous age differences, or particularly between bride and groom, and I do very much mean bride and groom, or were super, super young. So the best example of that I can think of off the top of my head is the Empress Matilda, the legitimate daughter of Henry I of England. She married Henry V of Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, when she was just a child. They were betrothed, which was an official ceremony which in many ways was as binding as marriage, when she was just 8 and her fiancé was 24. And she then entered her husband's household, marrying just 4 years later when she was just 12, the age of considered puberty and therefore biological adulthood. So yes, for nobles and for royalty, marriages when people were very, very young or when there were big age gaps could well happen, though usually consummation was delayed. But for the average person, this was simply not the case. Well, anybody could get married if they were willing once they'd hit puberty, figured at 12 for girls, such as Matilda, also known as Maud, or 14 for boys. Well, parental consent was just not required, and it wasn't required in England until the 18th century. It was different even then in Scotland, so if you're a fan of Regency romances and wonder why the doomed lovers flee to Gretna Green to get married, well, there you are, that's the reason. She didn't need parents' permission in Scotland. And I should note though, you don't need your parents' permission, you may well need your liege lords. Kings don't want to lose control of noble families, nor knights their peasants, or guilds their members. In general then, throughout this period and extending into the 19th century, the general truth is that whilst marriage was acceptable from puberty, for the majority of the population, and I really do mean the overwhelming, massive humanity, marriage, or at least the birth of the first child, which is something that appears much more in the records, is much easier to locate, certainly before Elizabethan marriage reforms in England in the 16th century, well, that seems to be about, on average, 10 years after puberty, so when a woman was in her early to mid-20s. For most people, most couples, early marriages were rare, and whilst the groom might be a year or two older than the bride, an average age of 21 to 25 seems generally accepted as the norm by historians today. For example, or a more specific example, in Yorkshire in the 14th and 15th centuries, the age range for most brides appears to be between about 18 and 22, and the age of grooms was similar. Rural Yorkshire women, they did tend to marry a little bit younger, in their late teens or early 20s, but their urban counterparts, conversely, they married a bit later, in their early to middle 20s. The age of first marriages, and I do stress first marriages, many widows would marry again for a whole variety of reasons, it does appear to rise slowly through the period, climbing to 25 years for women and 27 for men, generally in England and the Low Countries by the end of the 16th century, and to 26 for women in the 17th century, with a disclaimer and a little side note that there are different regionals and geographic trends. In general, rural marriages are a bit younger than urban ones, sometimes actually significantly younger. So they may remain in the sort of 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 in the countryside, where they raise to 24, 25, 28 in the towns. And in more remote areas, such as the Hebrides, the Scottish Highlands, Gallic Island, that is the bit of Ireland that isn't ruled by English monarchs, that rural trend of younger marriages is younger still, but still not the child marriage of popular belief. One final note, you might be familiar with the idea of prima noctis, particularly if you're a fan of the fantasy film Braveheart, which bears some superficial resemblance to 13th century Scotland and England, but mostly just because it has the names of some people that did genuinely exist. Well, in 19th century France, the idea of prima noctis became part of a series of popular beliefs that lords had several long-standing rights over their peasants, including the right to sleep with any bride the first night after her wedding. There are, however, no recorded instances of this happening in the Middle Ages that I can find. If I am wrong, and it's not impossible I am, do please let me know.